Did David compose all of the Psalms or even most of them? Some simply don't sound like a king wrote them, unless many he wrote were while he was still a shepherd boy. Also, were they mostly sung like our hymns today in worship or just daily life? Okay. Let me address the first question first, rather than switching them around like I usually do. David did not compose all of the Psalms. I don't think he composed most of them, although some of them specifically say he wrote them. And some of them specifically say someone else wrote them, namely Asaph. So by the time... Here goes. Please. That's right. Now I've got a guard. So how would they have been? Well, okay. So some probably were written. So this is an interesting thing about identity, right? Is that we change over time, but we're always our identity always includes who we were, right? So, the thing about David is he is a shepherd, right? He's a king, but he never stops being that shepherd boy, right? Whose father didn't even want to bring him in when the prophet, right, came to find the king. So, and we don't know exactly why. I had some, speculations about that, but we don't really know. So even if all of them were written when he was a king, they still bring all that experience and that awareness to his experience with God, right? So I don't think a king should sound like necessarily you think a king should, if he's talking to God, who is his king. Just some thoughts. As to how they were used, they would have been used in worship. They were sort of the prayer book of the returned exiles, if you take them all together, right? So there are a couple of psalms that are clearly written after the exile, right? By the waters of Babylon, there I can't quote it quite, but happy, the one it's 137. Happy is he who dashes their little ones upon the rocks, right? Because of the way they were treated in exile. So there are some that are clearly later. But more or less the way we have them now, in Hebrew at least, they were the sort of the prayer book of the exiles who returned. Okay, the remnant who returned to the land. Does that make sense? So, how do we use hymns? Well, we sing them in church, right? So probably these would have been sung in formal worship, right? Some of them are clearly sort of liturgical in nature. There's a whole section of Psalms that are called the Psalms of Ascent, right? About going up to Jerusalem. Well, that's, if you've ever been to Jerusalem, that's how you get to Jerusalem, is you go up. So not steeply, but you go up. And so it's clearly sort of a reference to that activity of the of the Hebrews going to worship as they were commanded at Jerusalem, right? Going up to Jerusalem. So it would have been used in formal ways, but it probably would have been used in informal ways too. I mean, hopefully we sing hymns just because we like them, right? Certainly those who are into contemporary Christian music will play it and sing it at various times. Some contemporary Christian music is great. Most of it, I think, is there's a little less content to it. But it's kind of the music of our life, right? It's in the vernacular, if you will. Right? If you're listening to music on the radio, it sounds more like contemporary Christian music, chances are, than, like hymns. Unless you're one of us weird people who sometimes listens to the classical music station or something like that. So, all right. Any follow-ups to that? You guys are really quiet.
Are you through with the question?
I'm through with the question unless you have follow-ups.
Okay, I just a little neat follow-up.
Yeah.
2-3 years ago, during the women's Bible study Thursday, we introduced spring and fall. So usually we didn't do things in the summer, but I just felt really led to keep something going, and so we studied some songs.
Right.
It was super, super interesting.
Yeah.
And I just did my little Google thing that there are different types, of course, of songs, praise and worship and thanksgiving and lament. But what was neat was that, I don't know how many, but at the very top of a lot of our Bibles, it would say, this one's to be used with the lyre in the heart.
Right.
Whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. There are instructions in there. Yeah.
And then we really got into one about the Leviathan and the
yes.
I drew a great picture of one on the board.
Awesome.
And it was just cool. They're just really all different, So,
yeah. Awesome.
That's cool.
Yes, ma'am.
So my related question is, if these were used in Jewish worship,
yes,
is the music from that is it possible that those original songs have still carried on? Did the ancient Jews have
clearly
musical notation? Yeah. Is there a way to know what they sounded like?
Yeah, no.
Okay. I didn't think they had notation, but
clearly it was musical.
Could they?
Right.
Is there any chance that they kept it? Do you see what I'm saying?
It's possible, right? I'm not aware of any particular music that has survived. Okay. Although, if you listen to Middle Eastern music or Jewish music, there is a very different style. Right, and it's more likely to have been in that sort of style than in our musical notation style.
Right. Another question I have is that since it's a song, how much? I know some of them have kind of alphabetical, Hebrew alphabetical structures to them that don't translate into English, right?
Yeah.
Do they rhyme? And has anyone, I guess what I'm asking is, has anyone tried translating the Psalms not by their meaning, but by their musicality?
That is a great question. So yes and no.
Okay.
One of the really great things about Hebrew is that its poetic tradition is translatable.
Okay. How
right?
is that?
Because Hebrew poetry operates mostly on parallelism.
Okay.
Right? So the repetitive stuff that you get in the Hebrew, especially in the poetry and the Psalms.
Praise him with the
exactly. Praise him with the lyre, praise him with psaltery and harp, right? You get, and there are different kinds of parallelism, right? There are kind of, there's...
one with another.
What's that?
Genesis 1 is another one.
Genesis 1 is another one, right? And anywhere you find that, you can say, it's poetry, even if it's not written in verse, right? So that's the nice thing about Hebrew poetry, is that it's sort of translatable. You don't get the word play, right?
That's why I was wondering.
Yeah, so there are times when a word will sound like another word, and so it will have an association that then once you translate it you don't have anymore, right? That sort of thing. One of my professors in seminary told a story about going to a synagogue service, right? And I don't remember whether it was a bar mitzvah or not, but it was like a father and son sharing the reading of a particular passage in Hebrew. And it was from one of the prophets, I forget which one, and they were reading along and kind of alternating reading. And then they got to one point where they stopped and they looked at each other and they chuckled, and then they just kept reading. and it was clearly a like play on words in the Hebrew that they got because they were reading the Hebrew, and if you didn't know the Hebrew, you just wouldn't get it, right? There's wordplay, there's sarcasm, there's things that you might not pick up on when you read the translation. But by and large, the poetic structure, at least, of Hebrew poetry is the parallel stuff. So, was there another part to that question? Okay.
The word Selah in the Psalms.
Selah, yes.
That keeps reading. I seem to recall notes on that's like musical instructions, or they
it seems to be, yes. Okay. It seems to be some sort of musical notation, like there's a ending there, right, or something. And we don't know much more than that.
Yeah. That's your favorite rabbi. Might be able to.
I'm not sure anybody completely knows.
I don't know either.
Well, there's one that's called Song of Solomon. Is that in?
Well, that's not a psalm. That's the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, which is a whole book of itself.
That's it, yeah. Exactly.
So, but yeah, the word Selah, if you just read the Psalms enough and see where it's in there, it's clearly an emphatic kind of thing, like so there, right? But what exactly it meant to do, I don't think anybody completely knows.
I have friends that name their kids that.
Selah? Alrighty then. So there.
Right? I think it's weird to name your kid after something. You're like, we're not exactly sure.
We don't know what it means, but
but it's there.
But it's in the Bible.
It's in the Bible.
So it sounds like a girl's name. Let's go for it.
It's kind of like how Oprah got named, but it was Orpah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I had looked it up once before, and basically like an explanation.
Right. Aha.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Because I was confused. I didn't know about it. It always shows up, but it doesn't.
Right. Yeah. It's not part of the structure. Right. Hang on. Suzelle, go ahead. Go ahead, Suzelle.
Back to the music.
Yes.
My husband is a choir boy.
Yeah.
He told me that they sung Gregorian music. And,
Yes.
And it's the notes which don't have the theme.
Right.
And so could you explain a bit about Gregorian?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good one. So all right. Where do I start? That's the game we play. It's all good. So I'm just trying to figure out where to start to make it clear. Gregorian is from Pope Gregory the First, Gregory the Great. So the reason we call it Gregorian is because he collected it all. Not all of it, but he collected all the stuff that was there in the day. So it pre-existed Gregory, and it was just the musical settings that he kind of collected and categorized. And so there's a pattern to the various, tones. It sounds like every tune is the same, but it's actually, there are like 8 categories of tones. So that's the Gregorian thing, but that is 7th century. Yeah. So that is not the music that the Hebrews would have been using with the Psalms. It is the music that that the church in the early centuries seems to have been using. And then it got collected by St. Gregory the Great.
It's terribly interesting, Father. Now you've reminded me, Father Klein did a whole talk about the great Gregorian,
Yeah.
the Gregory.
Yeah.
And it happens to be my stepson's name.
Yeah.
And it was on his birthday.
There you go.
Amazing things that happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Father could give you a whole dissertation on this. He's the one with the music degree, but.
But he was talking about Gregory. He did so many wonderful things. That was just one little thing he did.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was amazing, wasn't he?
Yeah. So, let me see. Any other questions on the music, the Psalms? Good? Okay. Next question. All right. So the next question is this. Why does the Episcopal Church continue with vestments when the quote-unquote modern churches do not? So this is just fun. So I need to quibble with this a little bit. So modern, I know the reason it's in scare quotes is because whoever asked this is probably aware of this. But modern actually refers to anything from about the middle of the 16th century on. So
The entire time the Episcopal Church has existed.
yes, exactly. The entire time the Episcopal Church has existed.
It's modern time.
Yeah, it has been modern times. So, but we know what you mean, right? The more, more contemporary, more trendy, right? Churches. So, there are a couple of answers to that. One is just to answer with a question, right? Which is, where in the Bible does it say that to stop wearing those awful Roman popish garments? It doesn't.
We did.
Right. So it doesn't say that. So if we're going strictly by the Bible, then there's no reason to get rid of them. From one perspective. So I want to be fair, right? The reason originally that the Reformation churches sort of did away with some of that stuff is because it was associated with the Roman Church, right? And with medieval Catholicism. Okay? All of those things actually go back to ancient Roman use. Okay, the stole and the maniple and the chasuble and the dalmatic, all of that stuff all of those things were originally kind of Roman garments, including the undergarments, the alb and all of that. But it was kept in that transition from the ancient Roman church to the medieval church, right? Part of the reason for that stuff is a sense of continuity. Okay? even though people weren't wearing those things anymore, in church we were, because the tradition, right? Because we are a part of that same church, right? That's what being Catholic means, right? Is to be a part of the universal church all the way back. Okay. Now, after we settle that, then we have to fight about what that church is like. Okay. So that's a whole nother conversation, but that's what it means. So the Eastern churches and the Western churches kind of developed in slightly different ways because they followed the different traditions of the Eastern and Western Roman empires. Okay? But you can still see parallels between, vestments in the Eastern churches and vestments in the Western churches. They just developed slightly differently. Okay? But they all developed, symbolic meanings over the years and all of that. So, part of the reason we do it is because we want to highlight our continuity with the church throughout the ages, right? You may not know this. The Church of England mostly did away with that stuff. And I was going to say in the beginning, but it depends on what beginning you're talking about, right? But under King Edward and Queen Elizabeth, Mary is sandwiched in between, right, with the restoration of the Roman Church, and then, right, so we go back and forth. But under King Edward and Queen Elizabeth, it was mostly chasuble. Well, not chasuble. It was mostly surplice and stole. Okay, so just you'd have a cassock on of whatever kind you were wearing at that time, and then the surplice is the outer white flowy garment, right? And then the stole goes on over it. And that was sort of what you wore, typically. In the 19th century, with the Oxford movement and the recovery of that sense of being a Catholic church, right? We've always claimed to be a Catholic church. But at different periods of history, our Protestantism and our Catholicism have been we've emphasized them to different degrees. Thank you. Yes. So, what's that? There's a kind of a pendulum, and so in that middle of the 19th century movement, to kind of recover the sense of, hey, we're a Catholic church, right? And that was how it started. Just quick history lesson. The Oxford movement began with a sermon preached against the dissolution of several dioceses in Ireland by the English Parliament. So the Parliament said, we got way too many dioceses in Ireland. There aren't enough Anglicans in Ireland that we need that many dioceses. We're going to kill a few of them. Right? We're just going to... Right? And it was Parliament that did that. And the Oxford movement fellows basically said, hey, you can't do that. It's the Church of Christ. The Parliament has no business changing the Church of Christ, right? Now, thank you. So, if the church wants to change that, they can. Butt out. And most of England was not particularly happy with that opinion at the time.
Can you refresh our memory on the surplice? What is the surplice?
The surplice is the white flowy thing that you wear over the cassock.
The servers.
The servers wear
those
surplices.
over their cassocks.
Yeah. Lay readers and servers wear surplices. And if I were doing if I were doing the morning and evening offices, right, then I would wear one too. So.
But when you have communion, you don't.
Well, when I'm celebrating communion, so when I'm celebrating communion, I do Eucharistic, right, garments, which is some people. Okay. Earlier on, they would have put on the stole because the stole is the stole itself is the symbol of office. Okay. So, the office of a presbyter is signified by the stole worn over both shoulders, right?
Next week, I can bring in some vestments you can show people.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. We could do a little demo. But so then, at the time that they would not have worn, dalmatics and tunicles and all of that stuff, they would have worn surplice and stole for the Eucharist. They would have worn surplice and hood and scarf for other things, because those are academic garments. Okay. Yes.
So, like, if you went to a nursing home and had a service, you'd just take your stole, right? If you
Right.
were doing the Eucharist.
Well, it depends, but yeah, I could do that. Yes, I can celebrate with just a stole. Right?
When you do confession,
When I do confession, I always wear a stole, because again, I'm exercising the office of the presbyter, of the elder, right? Of the priest.
Father, I'm interested in what you said about England doesn't have them anymore, but they do.
Doesn't have what anymore?
All the vestments.
Oh, they do, yes, but they didn't normally have that until sometime in the 19th century. And the Oxford movement, that pointing back to the Catholic nature of the Anglican Church, began in, say, the 1830s, and it slowly kind of took over the Anglican world, mostly, not entirely. So there are still churches in England where they would call themselves evangelical, and part of what that usually means is resisting some of that emphasis on the Catholic nature, right? And emphasizing more the gospel, right? Not that we don't we agree on the gospel, but it's a matter of emphasis. Yes?
How does this all originated? How did this was established that you guys have to, or the tradition of the people that were wearing this stuff? How did that start? What started that?
So you have here 2,000 years almost of historical evolution, right? And that's not like the telephone game, right? It doesn't end up something completely different, but it is a development, right, in how we look at these things, how we think of them. And things develop slightly differently in different places, right? So now we have such a small world, right, that there's a lot of sort of universalization going on, right? So, Roman priests in Africa and Roman priests in the U.S. often dress pretty much the same, right? That might not have always been the case, right? So there would have been, an Italian kind of style and an English kind of style. And part of it has to do with the climate, and part of it has to do with just being separated by space, right? Just all of that. It all would have followed the same kind of path, more or less. Like I said, you can still, even between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, you can still see, oh yeah, they wear like a funny conical thing, but that became the mitre over here, but that's, okay, so we restricted it to bishops and, right, that kind of stuff. So you can kind of identify most of the things. But there are differences, right? So, for instance, Percy Dearmer, who is an early 20th century priest who wrote a whole book on this stuff, okay? The Parson's Handbook, which you may or may not be able to get now. I have a copy because Nashotah House republished it a few years back. But he has this whole argument. He is an Englishman, and he hates the use of the biretta because the biretta is a continental garment, right? And so he thinks that English priests should wear the Canterbury cap if they're going to wear anything. So, I mean, both the Canterbury cap and the biretta and the academic mortarboard all came from the same hat, right? They're all the same thing originally, and they kind of develop into slightly different things, sort of, right? So,
except couldn't you say that the Old Testament Jews that you read about, they had ritual robes and everything.
They did.
And that's why they probably started later on from a Jewish tradition.
Maybe. So, all right. So this gets us back to the whole problematic nature of the priesthood. Okay? Remember that in the New Testament, we have presbyters, which is elders, and we have episcopi, who are overseers, bishops. Okay? And you can see the transformation of words from language to language. Okay? So presbyter becomes priest in English. Episkopos becomes bishop in English. Okay? And if you go back to the Latin, right, fairly early on, they had a sense of the presbyterate, right, my order, as having some sort of priestly function. Okay? But it's not the same as, say, an Old Testament priest or a pagan priest, for which there is a word. Those are the same word. Okay? In Greek, hieros. I'm not sure what the Hebrew is.
Hieros like heretic?
No, hieros like in hierarchy.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Hieros. So then one of the battle lines of the Reformation, right, was that whole question of how priestly is the priest, right? Because remember, the English word priest gets used for both of those, right? Presbyter and hieros, and the Latin comes in with the word priest also translates the Latin what's the Latin word for priest? Sacerdote, right? Sacerdotes. So that's kind of been a problem for us over a long time, is how do you understand that role? So the question then becomes, right, the word priest, like if you're thinking about an Old Testament priest or a pagan priest, the whole point of a priest is sacrifice, right? You're making the sacrifices for the people. You stand before God on behalf of the people because the people could not do that, right? It would destroy them. And so you stand in the presence of God, before God, on behalf of the people, and you make sacrifice and all of that stuff, right? And then you stand before the people on behalf of God, right? So clearly there is a priestly element to being a priest, but it's only an element, right? And so there has been, as I say, one of the battle lines of the Reformation was over that line, where we put that line. And the Reformers put it way back there, right? Presbyters. And in fact, we're even going to get rid of the overseers, and we're going to all be presbyters, right? And we're going to have a Presbyterian church ruled by presbyters. Darn it, right? Etc. Yes?
I have two related questions that are not related to each other.
Okay.
So my first question has to do with, or is the reason that Reformed churches are drawing it so far back, is that partly related to the because to me the sacrament would be the priestly part of Christian priests, right? So like
part of
in
it,
a certain sense, like body and blood, like the sacrifice.
It's the sacrifice, right?
So if you don't have that,
and certainly that's what Roman Catholics believe, right? Is that part of what you're doing is you're making sacrifice, and of course it's not you're re-sacrificing Jesus. They wouldn't say that if they're educated, right? But yeah.
Okay. So if you are removing yourself from sacraments too, then there's no priestly thing at all. By your definition of priest, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So my definition of that ancient sense of priest.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because by priest, I mean both.
Right.
Okay? What I'm trying to be very clear about, right, I'll use the word presbyter or priest to be clear, but priest is really something I use to cover both of them, because that's what the English word means, right? Is both of those.
You wouldn't use the word priest for, say, a Lutheran pastor.
I would.
I mean, they're not.
I would not, because they don't. Okay. There are all kinds of other questions in there that get messy, but yeah, because they don't. One of the big things for Luther is the priesthood of all believers, right? Mm-hmm. So they're more careful about that, and usually the word they use is pastor. Right?
So my related question on the way other side has to do with bishop, and then a lot of like modern churches, and I feel like usually African American churches, people like are bishop, Bishop, what's his name, right here in Dallas, T.D. Jakes,
right.
Is that them saying, well, I am the overseer of this congregation?
Yes.
But is it, I guess what I'm saying is like, is he also considering himself a presbyter? Like, are there people, do you see what I'm saying?
I think I do.
And is that just like a self-given, like,
it is it is a self-given thing, right? So, but it is not entirely without some merit.
Well, that was my question. Is how could you declare yourself a bishop if you are overseeing something, or like are the elders of these churches saying you are now Bishop T.D. Jakes or whoever?
Yeah,
right?
No. I mean, I'm not sure in every particular.
Or from a church leadership kind of.
I'm not sure how they would understand that.
Okay.
So I can't speak for them.
Fair enough.
Certainly from a generally Catholic perspective, they are not, right? Because from a Catholic perspective, there is one church, and that office can only be passed on by someone else in that office.
From like a linguistic perspective, if you were reading the scriptures and you were defining these terms.
Absolutely. Then that is the way it sort of has merit. Right? So in the early church, that's how they came up with that, right? I mean, they're not just pulling that. Yeah, that's exactly right. They're an overseer, right?
Right.
So they didn't just pull that out of the air because they thought it sounded cool.
Yeah,
right?
I didn't think so.
Right.
I was curious what the New Testament, what just the scriptures without the church tradition gives to
Yes.
that.
Nor are they naming
That.
themselves trying to be Catholic.
No, nor are they saying, well, we're part of the Catholic Church,
right,
right?
right.
So yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny because then sometimes you will see them wearing Episcopal regalia, right? Purple shirts and stuff,
So
right?
if TDJ
Even though they are not Catholic bishops, right? So, but that's not.
They want to be like
They just do. Right? I mean, they recognize the power of the symbol, and so they're using it. And right, what's the problem?
I
Right?
don't have a problem.
I know. I'm just
curious,
saying.
Like,
right?
if TD Jakes stepped down or died or something, would the new person be bishop, whoever? Over that
I
church?
think.
You see what I'm saying?
I think he would. I think that's just sort of the custom of that church, right? It may have been started by T.D. Jakes, or it may have been started by someone else. I'm not sure. I forget what it's called, but do you know T.D.
Really
Jakes?
big
He's a
church
big
now.
African American leader.
Potter's house, that's right.
Father's house. That's right.
Potter's.
Potter's house. Okay, so he's a really famous preacher.
In our area.
So historically, if you think about this, right, it makes sense. I had an Anglican friend who was a New Testament scholar, who this was his hobby horse, right? This is what he wanted to see happen, right? He argued that in the early church, the church was structured around the bishop, right? So in every worshiping community, you had a bishop and a community of presbyters, right? A college, if you will, of presbyters. And so the bishop had the ultimate authority, but then if the bishop was away, someone from the council of elders, the presbyters, could act on his behalf, and so they sort of shared authority in a way, right? So one way of saying that is the bishop is sort of the first among equals, right, of the elders, and certainly we see St. Peter kind of using it that way as a fellow elder, right, fellow presbyter. So he argued that is actually the way a worshiping congregation ought to be structured, right? That every local community, right? Because in the early church, you just had the Christians in Ephesus. And the Christians in Ephesus would get together to worship, right? And they had one community. Now, eventually, it seems what happened is that there became too many Christians for that structure to really work, and so they started worshiping in more localized groups, and the council of elders, the council of presbyters, was distributed among them to preside. Does that make sense? But then in the city there was still one bishop. Okay? So the question then becomes, my friend was arguing that we ought to go back to that, primary tradition of in every worshiping community having a bishop and a council of presbyters. I think that just sort of kicks the can down the road, because you still have to have the larger organizational structures in order to... So now you just have a bunch of bishops, and it's unmanageable, right? What I think the answer to that is to recognize that presbyters share in that overseeing, like, headship authority and responsibility with the bishop, and therefore it's appropriate for someone like us to be the head of a local worshiping community under the bishop still. Okay? Otherwise, you need bishops, which would be me, and archbishops, which would be my bishop, and then archbishops or something, right? Because you still have to have that structure.
I don't think you have that structure.
So what?
Don't we have that structure, though? You have a
Yeah,
presiding,
sort of. I mean, we have a presiding
who has
bishop.
his elders,
Well,
bishops.
but the presiding bishop would have to be more than that, right? So we would have to add a category at the top rather than at the bottom, right?
Are you
See what I
talking
mean?
about basically each parish having a bishop?
That's what he wanted. Yeah. And he was excited.
That, though. Like,
what's that?
What's the point of that? You are sort of the bishop, even though you're not the bishop. I mean,
Well,
that's
right.
your role.
Well, sort of. So
I mean, you're a priest, but I'm saying like you're
right. That's what I'm saying
doing
is the
what
solution.
that
to
bishop
this.
did, and
Except you can't.
Sort of, except that I don't have a council of presbyters under me,
you have your vestry.
but they're not presbyters, right? So
this is true. Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead, Father. What do you have to say?
Going back to the original question.
Yes. Thank
Would
you.
you say that the modern churches are
Yes.
acting out the Calvinist tradition?
Not necessarily Calvinist, but yeah, some form of that Protestant tradition that begins with the Reformers, right, on the Rhine and continues in Calvin, and has multiple, branches, right, lots and lots of them. But yeah, I think that's accurate. They're trying to be true to the Bible, and the Bible doesn't say anything about these things, and they've gotten away from the Catholic tradition for all kinds of other reasons, right? And so they don't use them.
It's kind of unnecessary.
So, right, they're unnecessary, and they make them look like those people down the street. So why do that? But again, it's that going back to your thing about the bishops in the African American church and that sort of thing. I mean, it's a mixed bag, right? They sort of want some of that and sort of don't want some of that, and so,
Well, when you're the rector of Holy Nativity, and we have a bishop in Dallas, what is the leadership role of the bishop to you when you're working in your own church? Sorry.
That is, that's a problematic question, right? Because we have been having vigorous fellowship over that very question for many years.
What's the question?
What is the relationship of the bishop? What's the working relationship of the bishop to the presbyter under the situation that we have? And largely it depends on the bishop and the presbyter involved and how they work together or don't. And I mean, in one sense, I exercise his ministry in this place, right? That's an accurate way to say that.
You're representing God's ministry.
But at the same time, he and I share an authority, right? So that's, I think it's a good thing, right? That we have, we're not exactly like the military, right? We have sort of a military structure, but not entirely, right?
In other words, he doesn't just give orders and do jobs.
That's right. Yeah, there's a Martin Thornton, who is a mid-20th century English priest who writes a lot about spirituality and prayer and stuff like that. He talks about the English Catholic tradition being having the sort of domestic quality that the Benedictine tradition has, right? We're not like the Jesuits, right, where you knuckle down and do what you're told. We are a family. And so, yes, there is a father, right, abbot, rector, whatever, right, who has authority over us. We ought not to disobey him haphazardly, right? At the same time, he has a responsibility to care for the people right, under his authority, and guide them and nurture them, right, as opposed to just issuing orders from on high, right? So that's a very English kind of thing. It's not merely English, but it's very Anglican.
Do you think that the bishop now is more an administrator or religious?
He's much more of an administrator than he ought to be. And I'm not talking about our current bishop. I'm talking about the role, right? So in the early church, deacons were the administrators, right? I mean, deacons ran programs. That's what they were for. And there's always been that sort of relationship between deacons and bishops, too. It was often the deacons who were elected bishops, not the presbyters, earlier on. Partly because of that.
That means you could have a female bishop. Just kidding.
Right, yeah, that's a whole other question. She's giving me a hard time.
I like that.
I know you. So, but there's always been that sort of connection. In the Eastern Church, they still always elect monks to be bishops, right? Because bishops have to be celibate in the Eastern Church.
Really?
Yeah.
The priests don't.
Priests do not have to be celibate. They remain in the state in which they're called. So they may not marry again if their wife dies, right? Okay. And if they are not married when they are ordained, they may not marry.
There's no wedding while you're a priest.
There's no wedding while you're a priest in the Eastern Church.
In the Eastern Church.
Right.
Or in the Catholic Church, because
the
church
or in the
his
Catholic
wife and
Church.
family do the Catholic.
That's right. That's right.
And I guess you wouldn't have been able to remarry probably either.
I don't think so.
But they don't get divorced either.
I'm always wondering about the spiritual guidance of decisions made,
mm-hmm.
By our laity, the people above us, above you. And
mm-hmm.
do they pray on this kind of stuff together?
One hopes. I know our bishop does.
What a novel idea.
Wait a minute. Is that what we're supposed to do? Just pray about stuff? Yeah, I mean, we have reached the point. We have reached the point, and this is a whole other conversation. You know this, but we've reached the point where we just don't agree on so much stuff that, I mean, I don't believe that most of the bishops of the Episcopal Church are actually praying to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I don't know what they're doing. But one would hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It still exists, and it's the problem.
Yeah.
It's the problem.
Yep.
The connotation is not there. I don't know.
Well, we have no communion, right? We're not in communion properly speaking, because communion requires dogmatic agreement, right? I mean, we can talk about the things that we disagree about, but there has to be a core of dogma that we do agree on in order to be even having the same conversation, and we no longer have that. So that's the problem that you're talking about. Yeah. Let's pray. Now that you mention it. Lord God, we thank you for all that you have done for us in this season of Easter. We ask you to give us that sense of being with you on a journey to holiness, to your kingdom, that we need to keep going. We ask you to bless this parish and its people. And we ask all this in the name of our Lord Jesus. Amen.
Amen.